So for attendees who are coming into the webinar, we're going to let folks roll in for a few minutes before we get started. So to attendees who are coming in, we're going to get started in just a couple minutes. We're letting folks continue to slowly roll in, and then we'll get going. I'm going to go ahead and say hi to Chris. Dr. Carter, thank you. Welcome from California.
Hello.
Again. Welcome virtually back to Southwestern University.
Oh, well, thank you for having me virtually. I appreciate it.
Dr. Carter was here for the Brown Symposium. That's been 2 years ago now, hasn't it? More than 2 years.
I don't know, man. Like,
I
mean, I'm like, like 2, 5. I'm like, well, time is,
sometime.
You know, I have no idea.
Well, welcome back. And I'm going to go ahead now and welcome our attendees. I think we're going to have more people kind of rolling in, but we'll go ahead and get this started since we have a solid 90 minutes of this planned right now. So welcome to the panel on eating animals. We're going to give attendees a chance to filter in, and hopefully you can see the Q&A option if you're an attendee at the bottom of the screen. You are welcome to enter questions, comments through that Q&A anytime during the presentations when a question comes to you. After all of the presentations, then we will address those questions. So hopefully you can see that. I want to take this opportunity to welcome our panelists today and also to introduce Rebecca Frazier. She is a sophomore and at Southwestern University, and she has put all of the work into organizing this panel as part of an internship in animal advocacy that she is doing this year. I've been lucky enough to be her faculty advisor on that, and she has done a great job. So Rebecca, I will turn it over to you.
Great, thank you so much. Good afternoon. I would like to welcome everyone to today's event, Eating Animals, Bringing Religious Perspectives to the Table. Today we will be hearing from a panel of 4 scholars who will discuss various religious connections to the way we eat and treat animals. Thank you all so much for being here. My name is Rebecca Frazier, and I'm a sophomore communication studies major and religion minor. This year, I have been participating in a fellowship program with the nonprofit animal advocacy organization, Shemayim Jewish Animal Advocacy. This program has allowed me to collaborate with various campus groups to facilitate educational events for the Southwestern community focused on exploring the vegan diet and advocating for a better world for animals. Today's event is my last program as part of my Shemayim Fellowship, and I would like to thank all of those who helped make today's event possible. First, I'd like to thank Dr. Laura Hobgood, Professor and Payton Chair in Religion and Environmental Studies, who served as my advisor for this event and who will be assisting in our discussion. I would also like to thank Southwestern's Department of Religion and Office of Paideia for funding this event. And finally, I'd like to welcome and thank our 4 panelists. So first, I'd like to introduce Dr. David Aftendilian of Texas Christian University. He is an associate professor of anthropology and director of the Human-Animal Relationships Hare Minor at Texas Christian University. He also co-chairs the Tarrant County Food Policy Council's Working Group on Community Gardens and Urban Agriculture. His research and teaching focus on animals, religion and culture, food justice, Native American religions and ecology, and nature-based contemplative practices and pedagogies. Welcome, Dr. Aftandilian. I would next like to welcome Reverend Dr. Christopher Carter of the University of San Diego. Dr. Carter's teaching and research interests are Black and womanist theological ethics, environmental ethics, religion and food, and religion and animals. In his publications, he explores the intersectional oppressions experienced by people of color, the environment, and animals. Currently, he is an assistant professor of theology at the University of San Diego and a Faith in Food fellow at Farm Forward. Thank you, Dr. Carter. And our next panelist is Dr. Jonathan Crane of Emory University. Dr. Crane holds a BA from Wheaton College in Massachusetts, an MA in International Peace Studies from the University of Notre Dame in Indiana, and an MPhil in Gandhian Thought. As a Wexner Graduate Fellow, he received both rabbinic ordination and a Master of Arts in Hebrew Letters from Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion. He completed a PhD in Modern Jewish Thought at the University of Toronto. He currently serves as the Raymond F. Shinazi Scholar in Bioethics and Jewish Thought in the Center for Ethics at Emory University, is a professor of medicine and religion, and is the founding director of the Food Studies and Ethics program at Emory. His scholarly research and teaching examine religion, ethics, bioethics, social and political ethics, food and eating ethics, animal ethics, and comparative religious ethics. Welcome, Dr. Crane. And now I would like to welcome our final panelist, Dr. Deepak Sharma of Case Western Reserve University. Dr. Sharma is a professor of religious studies in the College of Arts and Sciences at Case Western and a professor of bioethics in the Case Western Reserve University School of Medicine. After earning a BA in religion from Reed College, Sharma attended the University of Chicago Divinity School, where he received a PhD in the philosophy of religions. His most recent research includes matters pertaining to Hindu bioethics, which combine nicely with his reflections concerning cultural theory, racism, and post-colonialism. Welcome, Dr. Sharma, and thank you to all of our panelists. And we will now begin with our event. Each panelist will be given the opportunity to respond to 2 questions regarding the religious perspectives on the treatment and consumption of animals. A Q&A session will follow after both questions have been answered, so please be sure to think of questions as you listen, and please submit those questions through the Q&A feature of Zoom. And I'll now begin with our first question. And the question is, what does the religious tradition you study have to say about the treatment and consumption of animals? How does the answer to this question change in light of modern developments in the treatment of animals, such as factory farming? And Dr. Aftandilian, you are welcome to start us off when you're ready.
Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. I'm coming to you today from Texas Christian University in Fort Worth, Texas. And I wanted to acknowledge that TCU was built on the traditional homelands of the Wichita and affiliated tribes who have lived here since time immemorial, and we recognize their sovereignty over these lands. I also wanted to say that I am not myself Native American, so I am only going to speak about their worldviews. I do not and will not speak for them. Okay, so just to give you that background. So from a Native American perspective, the answer to the question that Rebecca just framed there, Native Americans see animals as persons with the ability to communicate, feel, think, build societies, practice religion, have souls. For example, the Yuchi, Native American people who used to live in the Southeast, but who now live in Oklahoma, tell an earth diver creation story that describes other animals as meeting in council, just as human people do, to talk with each other about how to find land. The Cherokee have several stories that describe other animals as religious. In one story, panthers are described as performing a green corn ceremony, arguably the most important annual ceremony performed by any of the Southeastern peoples. And in a contemporary story told by Mary Chiltosky, when the first man Kanati killed too many animals, the animals prayed to the Creator and asked him to help them. The Creator heard their prayers and acted to restrain humanity's greed in terms of the other animals. Native peoples also see animals as kin, meaning that they have family relationships to humans and therefore are willing to help us, both practically, including as food, and spiritually. For example, in the origin story of the Central Plains people known as the Arikara, the people emerged from underground, like the corn that they grow in their fields, assisted by Mother Corn herself. In the course of the story, the Arikara encounter various obstacles. First, they need to dig themselves out from underground, then cross a steep chasm, then a dense forest, and finally a vast lake. At each obstacle, an animal emerges from among the Arikara to help them, since at that time, both the Arikara and the other animals were one kind of being. For example, a badger, mole, and long-nosed mouse helped dig the tribe out from underground, and an owl helped them cut their way through the timber. After each of these obstacles was overcome, Mother Corn invited some of the people to stay behind as that sort of animal person if they wished, and some did every time. This story teaches then that the Arikara and all the other animals were once one kind of person, and they remain related to this day. Animals also have more spiritual power and more practical knowledge than humans because they have existed on the earth well before we have. For example, the Ojibwe of the Great Lakes region view humans as having been created last and least because every other animal emerged before us and therefore knows more about how to live in the world than we do. Native peoples also view animals as subjects with free will who can choose to give themselves as food to hunters or fishers or not. In the Nez Perce story of the origin of humans, which was told to my class last month by Mr. Jamie Pinkham, who is Nez Perce and is the former executive director of the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission, the creator gathered all the animals together at a spot on the Clearwater River in Idaho and told them that a new creature was coming, Nimapu, human beings, who would arrive naked, weak, and hungry. The creator asked the animals, "What will you do to help these poor new beings?" Salmon rose first and promised to provide food and whatever else the humans would need, and they have done so ever since. All of this means that humans should treat animals with the same respect according to human persons and family members, with the added big stick of the other animals' ability to punish disrespect by withholding themselves as food from hunters, sending disease, and so on. For the Koyukon of interior Alaska and many other native hunting peoples, the key way they show respect is by practicing a conservation ethic, taking only the animals and fish that they need and using all parts of an animal they kill, wasting nothing. Humans also need to reciprocate for the gift of animal lives by helping the animals, both spiritually and practically, such as by performing world renewal ceremonies like the green corn or the sun dance to renew the world on behalf of all beings. So how have these beliefs changed due to Native peoples' encounter with settler colonialists? Taken together, the impacts of colonialism plus forced migration to cities in search of wage labor, forced Christianization via missions and boarding schools, have broken many of the spiritual bonds Native people have traditionally felt to animals. Growing accustomed out of necessity to eating a poor people's diet in US cities that consists of lots of cheap fast food has also undermined natives' traditional gathered and hunted or fished diet. And finally, the loss of land and sovereignty over it means natives cannot do ceremonies on their lands like they used to, or practice other caring land management for animals.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Aftandilian, and Dr. Carter, if you would like to continue.
I had to unmute myself. I've been using Zoom for a year and I still start talking with it muted. So I'm glad I remembered to do that. But thank you, Rebecca, for having me here. And thank you all for being here and participating and listening. I'm going to focus. It's interesting because I'm actually curious what Jonathan's going to say, because so much of the when I generally have this conversation, I tend to start with stories and narratives from the Hebrew Bible, but I'm going to wait because I imagine that is something he's going to talk about. However, what I'd like to do is to begin really by discussing the ways in which we, within the Christian tradition, talk about consumption of flesh relative to issues of hospitality. And so for many of you are familiar with this passage or the passages, the first one that probably comes to mind is, Paul talking about meat sacrificed to idols, and kind of what does this mean in terms of, is this wrong, and is this isn't, and or is this something that we should be avoided or something that people can participate in? And ultimately, you know, Paul in his kind of typical kind of pastoral response tries to come up with this compromise where he's like, okay, for those of you who feels like this is a sin, something you shouldn't do, then you should not do it. But for other folks who do not feel this way, then it is fine, right? But at its core, what Paul is really getting at is this idea of hospitality and what this means in terms of honoring people's boundaries and working with them where they are, right? With respect to their own kind of moral development, moral growth, and persuading them. Actually, I would say pulling them, luring them into a different way of being in the world. One might read the passage in that way. And so when I think about the kind of roles and responsibilities that emerge within the Christian tradition with respect to non-human nature, non-human animals, and eating them, that passage always comes to mind because I think it really prioritizes the space of hospitality. How are we called to be in relationship and hospitable to non-human creatures, right? To other animals, and how does that impact how we consume flesh, right? And so when you think about it from that perspective, I think it connotes a couple of things. One, I think it particular kind of relational responsibilities and obligations we have to the treatment of animals. So there's a way in which I think you can read that passage and other New Testament, particularly Pauline narratives that really speak about not only care for and responsibility to, but how this is kind of indicative of your own spirituality, kind of reflective of your own kind of character and morality that I think is really crucial when you're thinking about the treatment of the least of these, right? The kind of common Christian vernacular, right? And so I think that's an important jumping off point. And then I think beyond that, moving to the consumption of animals, I think this is what's really, it puts the onus, I would argue, on the consumer, right? The person who's actually saying, okay, if eating this way, if I consume some animal flesh, how is this going to be received by those who I'm a guest, right? Who I'm with? What does that actually mean for me? Now I commit this, and I think part of what influences my interpretation is my people are from Louisiana, Mississippi, but mostly from Louisiana, and so they ate a lot of seafood growing up. I happen to be allergic to shellfish. I'm the only person in my family allergic to shellfish. So my whole life, right, my parents had to make me, if they did decide that I could actually have gumbo, they have to make something separate, a separate dish of red beans and rice, or any kind of thing that was traditionally, culturally specific food. We had to have something separate. And so I grew up with this notion that it was hospitable for me to eat differently around people, that it was hospitable for me to request to eat something differently, because otherwise it literally could kill me. And so I think the framework of hospitality is crucial when we're talking about not only the treatment of animals, but the consumption of animals and what that actually means. And I think you can glean a lot from the New Testament text and the Christian tradition, broadly understood, from that perspective. However, the question that I think is really important, that I want to spend a little bit more time unpacking, is, again, how does the answer to this question change in light of modern developments in the treatment of animals such as factory farming? Now, for me, this is where I think, again, building on the logic of hospitality, one not only should include non-human animals as such, but also the ways that it impacts broader communities, right? So by this, we want to look at, I think it's important for us to look at the passage now, again, I come at this as a liberation theologian, so I want to be clear, as someone who reads the Gospels, who reads the stories of Jesus, as a prophet who comes to liberate the oppressed, right? To let the poor go free, to speak truth to power, that kind of way in which Jesus is quoting these passages in Isaiah and Luke 4. And so with that in mind, this idea, right, that you have this way of being in the world that's supposed to be anti-oppressive, that's supposed to be calling people into a new community, right? Like literally calling them into a better way of being in the world. If we take that seriously, we have to ask ourselves, what is the impact, right, of our current industrial agricultural model on these communities that are harmed? Not only the non-human animals, which is crucial, which is important. We could talk about the ways in which those animals suffer, the way they're abused and how they're exploited. That I want to honor that and say that 100% matters, and that kind of abuse is inconsistent with the hospitality that I spoke about earlier. I also want to add to that for me, coming at this from the perspective of a Black man, the people who have been subjected to that kind of labor and that kind of toil within an American context have disproportionately been Black people and other people of color, right? So you're thinking about those who are harmed by the industrial agricultural model in terms of who lives in the area, it's mostly Black and Latinx people, people of color. If you think about people who work in those factories, right, it's mostly Black and Latinx and other marginalized communities. There's an excellent article that came out. It was actually a New York Times article. It came out in 2000. It's called "At the Slaughterhouse, Some Things Never Die." And what's fascinating, you can really see how racism works, right? Because one of the author wrote how when people got hired in the slaughterhouse, people got assigned jobs really relative to their racial caste. And I'm using that word intentionally because there's a really good, excellent book that just came out called Caste that I thought really has helped me frame this language. And what the article points out is that the Black women were the people who were assigned the room to clean out pig intestines, chitterlings, right? They literally said, okay, the Black women are going to go here. They're going to put the Black men at the jobs that are going to be the bloodiest, right? And then they would put like white people who are doing that job because they're on parole or probation or whatever, like folding boxes and other things. And so there's a way in which even within this structure, not only is it the cruelty to animals, not only is it reinforcing hierarchical oppression, right, of people having to witness the kind of murder and torture that they're going through, it reinforces a kind of racist state that is fundamentally anti-Christian, that's fundamentally against the gospel. And so when we think about the consequences of this system relative to where we are today, I think we are left. It becomes an obvious choice, I believe, that we have to opt out of this structure, opt out of this way in which we have decided to industrialize animal agriculture and to envision something new. I would argue that within the Christian tradition, it becomes a moral obligation on multiple fronts to make this kind of shift and change today.
Thank you so much, Dr. Carter and Dr. Crane, whenever you're ready.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this important conversation. And it's lovely to see my friends and colleagues on this panel and to always learn from you. Yes, Dr. Carter, there's a lot there in the biblical text for us to unpack. It's a well-trod material. I am going to just sort of gloss over a few things and dive into a more urgent text. So recent events in this pandemic in particular have highlighted several dimensions of the connections between food and faith in Judaism in particular. As articulated in the Bible, Judaism understands animals that to be entities God created, that some are identified as clean and others unclean, some are to be sacrificed and others not. It's fitting that this panel occurs this week when Jews around the world have just read this last weekend from the book of Leviticus, several rules and regulations about which animals may actually be consumed, not just sacrificed. Eating animal flesh is considered in the biblical world as a concession from God to humankind. This is because in the beginning, humans were to eat a vegetarian or even if not, a vegan diet. It was only after the flood that humans were permitted to eat animal flesh if they so desired. Eating animals is not a requirement, Judaically speaking. If one wants to eat animals, one may, but it must be done in a particular manner. Rabbinic scholars, far long after the Bible had been codified and closed, rabbinic scholars expanded upon the biblical strictures to construct what we now know as kashrut, rules and regulations. Kashrut, on the whole, pertains to how animals are to be killed, how they are to be prepared and cooked in various dishes, and how they are to be consumed. While these famous and complex rules merit their own investigation, I want to turn right now to a topic that I think is more intriguing and urgent. While I was working on an essay about Judaic ethics in a pandemic, I came across an ancient source that really surprised me. It was a vignette found in the Babylonian Talmud that speaks of Judah Hanasi, the greatest sage in the early 3rd century. And it goes this way. It's just 3 sentences long. They said to Rabbi Judah, "There's a plague among the pigs." Rabbi Judah decreed a fast. Let us say that Rabbi Judah maintains that a plague affecting one species affects all species. No, pigs are different since their organs are similar to those of human beings. This brief vignette surprised me for many reasons. First, there's concern about the spillover effect of diseases crossing from one species to another. And this notion is occurring long before germ theory took hold among naturalists and scientists in the late 19th century. Second, this concern about zoonotic diseases. is found in a religious resource and not in medical or public health or even farming instructions, much less in a secular tractate. Third, this Jewish concern is about diseases arising from pigs of all creatures, an animal Judaism finds repugnant and dissuades Jews from working with them in any meaningful way. Fourth, it speaks of pigs that by this time in early 3rd century were already, the practice was to raise them in pens, much like other domesticated ruminants. That is, keeping pigs in confinement, even if not at the scale that, or intensity as they are today. Keeping pigs in confinement creates an environment ripe for breeding lethal pathogens. Fifth, this source pertains to animals non-Jews farm and consume, not because they must, but because they like to, or are encouraged or incentivized to by their cultures and contexts. That is, this source speaks of a deadly pandemic that arises and spills over from one species to the next because of the palate preferences of some human beings. It teaches that all humans are susceptible to a lethal pathogen because of the hedonism of a few. And sixth, another thing that surprised me is that no secondary scholarship yet exists on this text. I was surprised because this is not a random fringe source from some marginalized Jewish sect abandoned in the dustbin of history. On the contrary, it is from the Babylonian Talmud, the central repository of the foundations of Rabbinic Judaism, including all streams of modern Jewry. I was pleased to find that ancient, medieval, early modern, and even some modern sages, rabbinic sages, speak about infectious pandemics arising from pigs. They comment on this text. And they all convey great concern about the spillover effect, though of course they didn't use that term. And they all commend urgent response to mitigate the inevitable spread of the pandemic, so to protect Jewish communities from its ravages. I was unsurprised about the absence of scholarship. But just as this is perhaps because it's not easy to address one's own eating practices and double standards, it's also even more uncomfortable when the concern is the eating practices of another community, especially those who have greater control of economic and political power. For who am I to talk about your dietary habits? Yet this is precisely one of the points of this source in our conversation today, that all of our eating practices inexorably impact others, and vice versa. And speaking of vice versa, among the ancient religious sources I studied, I found one in the Islamic textual tradition. From the 10th century, Ikhwan al-Safa wa Kulan al-Wafa, the Brethren of Purity and True Friends, from a sect of Shia Islam in Basra, Iraq. And they wrote in their encyclopedia something called The Case of Animals versus Man Before the King of the Jinn. And they addressed many of the ways that humans harm and sicken animals. And the pigs, in fact, speak in that case, and they talk about how they suffer because of the ways that human beings sicken them. In short, zoonotic and reverse zoonotic or anthropognosis diseases have long plagued civilizations, and religions, Judaism and Islam in particular, have long known this. And yet, in 2020, we saw several food animal corporations go to great lengths to insist that they and their practices were not to blame for the current pandemic. They were proud of the way that their essential worker status, that even though they were putting their workers to work and calling them essential workers, they were nonetheless putting Black and brown bodies in harm's way. In their view, they were the true heroes, providing America with much needed protein, and they should not be vilified for doing so. I think those kinds of campaigns miss the larger point, that contemporary animal husbandry practices like factory farming are precisely the culprit for the vast majority of recent zoonotic and reverse zoonotic pandemics. This has been the concern since at least the 3rd century, and it remains an issue too many today are quick to dismiss. Denial and deflection, I think, are common strategies when dealing with cognitive dissonance, and much scholarship has been developed that look at these strategies among meat consumers and producers. Such dismissiveness has proven lethal. The world now suffers a global pandemic and will again, unless and until industrialized farm animal practices are dramatically, if not radically, altered. I suggest that these ancient religious sources demonstrate that it's far wiser and healthier to acknowledge the fact that diseases can and do spill over across species, that they often do so when animals are kept in ways unnatural to their habits, and that humans should do all that they can to mitigate, if not prevent, the emergence of these events in the first place, even if that means changing how animals are housed, raised, processed, and consumed, if at all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Crane, and Dr. Sharma. You can begin anytime you're ready.
Sure, I'm ready. Now for something completely different. So I'll be thinking and speaking with you about Hinduism and Jainism. And since my guess is that maybe the vast majority of you don't know too much about those traditions, let me do some summary that's relevant with regard to animals. So first and foremost, we could say that the earliest Hindu practices, which we would call Vedic Sacrifice, and this occurred about 1600 BCE, so it's quite some time ago, really did involve sacrificing animals and eating animals. And the current portrayal of Hinduism, which is usually portrayed as being vegetarian, which it isn't, ignores the historical roots of the importance and primacy of animal sacrifice in this early form of Hinduism. And in such cases, there were no animals that couldn't be sacrificed. There were no restrictions. And of course, they were limited to the animals that were available to them in the Indus Valley and in South Asia. So it wasn't like they were sacrificing giraffes because there were no giraffes there to sacrifice. Fine. But there were very detailed texts about sacrificing horses and sacrificing cows, and the consumption of both of those after being offered to a god, after the sacrifice and after it was offered to a god, there was really elaborate characterizations of how it should be eaten, in what order it should be eaten, and it was celebrated to eat these items. So this is something that's very different from the current portrayal that you find by many Hindus, that Hindus are vegetarians and they don't have any animosity towards animals, let's say. Now, this practice existed between about 1600 BC and about 800 BCE. And at 800 BCE, we had these huge, massive, interesting shifts in the ways that Hindus and South Asians think. And one of the most important groups that came out of this shift between 8th century and 6th century BCE is the tradition of Jainism, which I'll speak about in a minute. And Jainism, one could say, was a direct reaction to the violence against animals in the sacrifice. And so Jainism is a tradition of non-violence, ahimsa. And I think Dr. Crane probably was exposed to a lot of that when he was working in Ahmedabad learning about Gandhi. So non-violence is essential to Jainism. And again, a complete reaction against Vedic sacrifice. And just a quick aside, the Hinduism that follows the 8th century, there are portions of that Hinduism that appropriated the Jain non-violence. And I'll get back to that in a minute, okay? And this is, of course, directed towards animals. So Jains are a very, very interesting group that recognizes that all actions involve, or the consequence of all the actions is violence towards another creature. And between 8th century and 6th century BCE, we have the development of an idea of the self, a self. Sometimes people translate it as soul, but that seems to be too Judeo-Christian. So let's just go with self, and that this self inhabits all sentient creatures. That's to say humans, non-human animals, mammals, reptiles, bugs, and so on, insects, if there's a difference between bug and insects, let's say, bacteria, you name it. All sentient creatures have this Atman, A-T-M-A-N, which is this self. And once that gets loaded into this kind of situation, and add to that the kind of theory of karma and rebirth, which many of you, I'm sure, have heard of karma, and that your actions in this life and in previous lives has a direct impact on where you're born, as a human or as a monkey or as a cockroach or as a bacteria, and so on. So once this combination of Jain ahimsa and then a belief that there's an Atman that's linked to karma enter the picture, then the treatment of animals changes substantially. Clearly for Jains will treat animals as if they are fellow sentient creatures, right? And there's absolutely and utterly a restriction on eating animals or harming animals in any way. And you have Jains the monastic Jains will walk around with a little broom in their hand and brush the path in front of them to make sure they don't step on an ant or a mouse or anything else that could be there. So when you're thinking about the treatment of animals and consumption of animals, Jains are at one end of this continuum where they are live their lives entirely and completely aware of and indexed to the treatment of animals. That's the essential component of their life, which is, that is to say, to act in ways that did not cause any harm to any sentient creature, okay? And Jains, to leap ahead, are of course against any kind of animal factory farming. They in fact, in India today, you have kind of rescue missions where Jains will seek out animals and put them in like not a zoo at all, but in a place where they can recover or die easily, as opposed to dying on the streets, and so on. And so people donate, Jains donate tons of money to these sorts of organizations. And they're like a big part of being a Jain is trying to help any of these animals. And they protest against any kind of treatment of animals by others in India. Now with Hindus, this is even very interesting indeed, is that post 8th century BCE, you have upper caste Hindus, largely Brahmins, the priestly class, who start remodeling themselves after Jains. So if you take Jainism and you make it slightly Hindu, or you take Hinduism and make it slightly Jain, then you have what Brahmins do. So post 8th to 6th century BCE, Brahmins who used to do the sacrifice and eat the meat now are acting in ways to decrease the amount of violence that they have towards animals. And this largely revolves on consuming meat. So Brahmins post 6th century, 7th century BCE are not meat eaters anymore, okay? And they are the minority community in India. The vast majority of Hindus are not Brahmins, and they eat plenty of meat. And they continue to eat meat, and they happily eat meat, and they embrace factory farming, and they are Hindus. And they have no problem with it. The more meat, the merrier, let's just say. So when we think about Hindus as vegetarians, we're really thinking about Hindus as Brahmins who are appropriating Jainism, and that they are propagating kind of ideas about animal, preventing the death of animals and certainly not eating meat. Now, let me make two more points and then I'll close up here. Is that, and this is also tremendously interesting, I think, is that currently in India, the right-wing Hindu fundamentalist party, the Bharatiya Janata Party, BJP, is in control of India, and they have a nationalist kind of nationalist, xenophobic sort of position where they want India to be entirely Hindu. And they consequently demonize Muslims who eat meat, right? So they demonize traditions and groups of people who are Christians and Muslims who eat meat are demonized. And there's a big wave of what to say, about treating animals properly and not eating meat, of vegetarianism, but it's largely connected to Hindu nationalism, right? So it's a Hindu nationalist position. And so you have, it's really sad in a way, is that you have stories about Muslims who are seeking to kill cows And there'll be like cow wrestler Muslims who go and kill cows so they can eat meat, and there'll be some WhatsApp posting about this, and then people will have a mob go kill that Muslim. And this, of course, is all about purifying the Hindu state, so to speak, so that there are no more Muslims there, no more meat eaters, and making it more Brahmin-like. But ironically, and tremendous irony, the lower classes that eat a lot of meat still embrace the BJP, despite the BJP really being kind of anti-meat eating. So there's a lot of confusion there. Let me make my last point. And it only occurred to me listening to Dr. Crane's points, is that Hindu gods, of which there are very many, we don't need to go into that, but there are at least 365 million, they say. Gods are usually associated with some animal as their vehicle or as their friend or devotee or something like that. And the Hindu god Ganesh, the elephant-headed god, is comically associated with mice, or sometimes people say rats. And this has led some Hindus to be against the killing of rats and mice, which is, kind of a pleasant sort of idea about helping animals. But as Dr. Crane has observed in his talk, is that there have been some instances where diseases have been carried by, plague and so on, have been carried by mice and rats, and Hindus have been reluctant to kill them. Same thing with monkeys. There's a god named Brahma, and his right-hand man is the god named Hanuman. Hanuman is the monkey god. And so there's a toleration for monkeys in India that has permitted monkeys to kind of run into people's houses and steal food and so on and be very aggressive, because people are anxious about or worried about killing the monkeys and reducing the monkey population. And this has been both good and bad. Good in the sense of the recognition that the monkey is just yet another Atman and one shouldn't harm it. But there's some complicated tension between these different populations that are trying to live together. So there's some, not some easy answers, but some historical complexities. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A, and we will be moving on to our second question. And our second question is, what actions would you encourage members of the religious communities that you study to take in order to bring their eating choices in line with their religious beliefs? And Dr. Aftandilian, you can start us off.
So first of all, as someone who's not myself Indigenous, it's not for me to say what Native people should do about anything. But what I can do is share with you how some Native people themselves have been answering the question that was just asked in recent years. So first, let me share the work of Margaret Robinson on Native veganism. Dr. Robinson is a member of the Lennox Island First Nation and is assistant professor in the Department of Sociology and Social Anthropology at Dalhousie University in Nova Scotia. Dr. Robinson argues from a feminist intersectional perspective that because of their long-standing spiritual beliefs in animal personhood and the desire to treat animals well, and in light of the horrors faced by animals confined in factory farms, that her people, the Micmac, should today switch to veganism. She says, quote, "The personhood of animals, their self-determination, and our regret at their death all show that choosing not to ask for their sacrifice is a legitimately Aboriginal option." She views meat eating as a symbol of patriarchy shared with settler colonialists, and feels that since nearly all Micmac now have access to other options for food, meat eating is no longer justified. Dr. Robinson's is very much a minority position among Native Americans, which she herself recognizes. Many natives, she acknowledges, are opposed to veganism because they associate it with whiteness and white supremacy, see veganism as a rich people thing associated with class privilege, view turning aside from the gift of their lives that animals made to Native peoples at the beginning of time as disrespecting both the animals and traditional Micmac culture. And because hunting is a traditionally male activity among the Micmac, attacking hunting is also seen as an attack on masculinity. Another path that many tribes, especially Plains peoples, have been following in the past couple decades involves restoration of tribal buffalo herds. The Intertribal Buffalo Council is a coalition of 69 member tribes in 19 states that together have restored more than 20,000 buffalo to native lands. The ITBC was founded in 1992, quote, to restore buffalo to Indian country in order to preserve our historical, cultural, traditional, and spiritual relationship for future generations. To reestablish healthy buffalo populations on tribal lands is to reestablish hope for Indian people. Returning the buffalo to tribal lands will help heal the land, the animal, and the spirit of the Indian people. So restoring the buffalo to their ancestral home on the plains is seen by member tribes as part of their responsibility as native peoples to care for animals, plants, and the land. Raising buffalo for meat is also seen as a way to provide sustainable economic development for tribes that often lack such opportunities. It's hard to find a job on an isolated Lakota reservation like Cheyenne River in the Northern Plains, but there's plenty of space to raise buffalo, who can then continue to care for the Lakota as they have since both nations emerged together into this world. Raising buffalo also helps sustain and revitalize native religious and cultural traditions. For example, Albert Whitehat Sr. explains in his book Zuya that buffalo taught the Lakota how to organize themselves into families and clans. Just watching the buffalo can therefore teach native people valuable lessons. This is why the Fort Belknap Reservation in Montana, home of the Assiniboine and Gros Ventre tribes, has created a buffalo-based drug and alcohol addiction treatment program for their members in partnership with the tribal buffalo herd. Buffalo meat is also much healthier to eat than the meat of beef cattle, and can therefore help tribes address diet-related diseases that afflict native peoples at very high rates, such as diabetes and heart disease. A 3-ounce serving of buffalo meat has 93 calories, 1.8 grams of fat, and 43 milligrams cholesterol, compared to a 3-ounce serving of beef, which has 183 calories, 8.7 grams of fat, and 55 milligrams of cholesterol. Other tribes are also doing restoration work appropriate to the animals with whom they've had a historical reciprocal relationship. For example, the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission that I mentioned earlier is a partnership of 4 Northwestern tribes who are working to support the protection and restoration of salmon, lamprey, and sturgeon. Finally, there's a growing movement today that advocates for Native American food sovereignty. According to the principles of native food sovereignty, which were adopted by a diverse coalition of tribes at Taos, New Mexico in 2008, quote, food sovereignty is the right of peoples to produce healthy and culturally appropriate food through ecologically sound and sustainable methods, as well as the right to define their own food and agriculture systems. In other words, this means native peoples want to raise food the way they think the food should be raised. They want to establish the food system and distribute the food as they want it to be done. Food sovereignty is also intimately intertwined with tribal sovereignty for native peoples in the US. This means the right to be independent and self-governing, which, as you might expect, is a huge challenge for peoples who are treated under US law as domestic dependent nations. Very often, decisions are still made for the tribes by various levels of the US and state governments, which can make it very difficult for Native Americans to enjoy food sovereignty or any other kind of sovereignty for that matter. If you're interested in learning more about Native food sovereignty, there's a great book that was just published a couple years ago, edited by Devin Mehesua and Elizabeth Hoover. It's called Indigenous Food Sovereignty in the United States. And there's a great documentary film on the topic that came out just last year in 2020 called Gather. You can access Gather via Canopy if your library has that, or you can watch it by iTunes, Amazon, Vimeo, and so forth. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Carter, if you'd like to go next.
Yeah, actually, Dr. Aptantillian, Dr. Hoover actually just spoke at USD and like 3 weeks ago, and her current book project, she profiled, and within the framework of food sovereignty, she profiled Indigenous chefs and kind of what's happening in that space to talk about food sovereignty from that perspective, which was just super fascinating. So I would really encourage you to check out that book and her work in general. It's quite, it's just great. It's just great work. I should just say that. So this is a very interesting question because I think, you know, no tradition is monolithic. And for any of you, so I teach, University of San Diego is a predominantly white institution. The vast majority of my students are not students of color. And for those of them that are Christian, have rarely gone to a Black church, right? Or a church that's predominantly people of color, right? And so when I teach courses on race and religion, or my Black and Womanist Theology class, one of the assignments that my students do is to go visit a Black church. And for those students that have never done it, it's always profound because they come back and they're just like, this is not like any church I've ever been to. And I want them to do that. And I want to start by saying, I want to preface by saying this, that I believe there are many Christianities, right? And I think that's something we have to acknowledge, and the fact that students that I've had have grown up practicing Christianity, but have not had an experience of anything that's remotely near what you might experience in a Black church, just speaks to the variety of Christian ways in which people practice Christianity. Now, with all that being said, I'm also, as you mentioned, Reverend Dr. Carter. And so there's a part of me that looks at this from very much a practical theologian perspective. And I want to tell you a little bit about what I did when I was the pastor at the previous church I worked at prior to becoming a professor, which is First United Methodist Church in Compton, California. And tell a little bit more about the work I've been doing with congregations in terms of wrestling with this question. So back when I was in Compton, the first thing I did was did an assessment of what was going on in the community, where were people actually getting their food from. I made it very contextual. And so I would argue that is first and foremost what we ought to be doing. So my congregation, it was in Compton. And for most people's image of Compton is like, you know, late 1980s, like, was something I know you weren't even born yet, but, you know, there were folks in there who know what I'm talking about. Like, there's this way in which Compton has this perception of very violent, and it's not quite that anymore, but it definitely has the after effects, right, of that kind of drug epidemic. And so it's a very poor city, broadly speaking. And so most of my congregation was pretty, I would say, poor to maybe lower middle class. And so what I wanted to do was have them think critically about where we're getting our food from first, and then what that might mean about respecting and honoring our health and how that relates to our faith tradition. So part of the reason I wanted them to understand where they're getting their food from was to see how these things are interconnected. That's what I wanted to do. I wanted them to see, okay, where we're purchasing our food from? Where's it coming from? Who is empowered by that purchase? Is that money staying in the community? Is it going outside of the community? How much of that economic aspect is actually part of our religious tradition? How might we think critically about supporting like self-determination, which is really important, I would argue, at this church I was working at was mostly Black and Asian Pacific Islander. And so I grounded it in the contextual realities of the community. First and foremost, I would say that's one thing I think people ought to do. And when we did that, after we did this kind of assessment, a few things emerged. One is that a lot of people in my church were suffering from health-related issues due to poor diet, mostly due to either low income or just being in an area where a kind of what we might call an American diet, right, really broadly speaking, was really promoted, right? And so what we talked about doing, or at least what I began to do, is begin to think theologically, not only about food, think theologically about the impact it has on our bodies, and then to say, how might this influence and shape our capacity to practice Christianity or to be the Christians that we believe God has called us to be. So it's very much thinking about it holistically and interconnectedly. It wasn't just about animals. It wasn't just about food. It was recognizing all these things and how they work together. I would say if you're working with communities of color, marginalized people, or poor people, to talk about or to begin the conversation around animal suffering really can dismiss, it's felt as though it dismisses their real and tangible experience of suffering, the real and tangible experience of what's happening in the community and the economic problems that they have. And so approaching it in a way that's deeply interconnected, they can understand that, I think is crucial. And so when we did that, right, Then we began to talk about, well, what kinds of ways we might change our diet that's reflective of who we think God has called us to be as people. Now, for this predominantly Black church, right, it was an amazing conversation because so many of my members are actually originally literally from where you all are, from Texas, from Arkansas, from Louisiana, from the South, right? They moved west. And so they were from these rural places where they lived on farms. And so it was this way in which for them, it was an opportunity, I think, for them to reconnect with ways of eating and being in the world that they actually grew up with that felt more home to them, but giving them the tools to actually accomplish that. So what we did is we partnered with local schools, like 2 schools that are around us to start, because my congregation is really old, so we couldn't have a garden. We helped fund and maintain a community garden. We started and started fundraising for a local farmers market, and I want to distinguish what that means in a little bit, to come to Compton, right? And we began to reshape and the dietary practices of that community through the lens of like practicing Christianity, what it means to be a Christian. How might I live in such a way, embodied wise, right, to be the kind of person that I think God's called me to be. So again, it's very holistic, is the kind of the approach that I would argue is the best approach to take. That necessitated less consumption of meat, because we talked about the consequences of the meat that we're consuming, where it comes from, and who it harms. That's when I did this very strategically, because I knew it's a difficult topic, so you want to structure it like that. And in my mind, that was the best way to go. Once I was able to connect that to the suffering that was happening in the community, it was a very easy sell. It was a very easy sell to be like, we need to really think about the how we're eating, what we're eating, and how it harms our communities and how it harms our bodies. Now, it also helped that their pastor was vegan, and in the Black church tradition, when the pastor eats one way, it does have influence over everybody else, right? So when I'm making my vegan greens, right, that don't have pork in it, that have orange juice and raisins, and people are like, well, that seems weird, but it's delicious, right? Like they eat that and they're like, oh, wow, this is pretty good. Like, so it was very much done kind of intentionally, I want to say. And I felt like that was probably a more effective and the most effective way to do it. And I would argue thinking about things contextually, strategically, and tying it into their own lived experience is the way to go. Being mindful of the historical tensions that may arise depending on the community that you're working with, right? And so if you're working with a predominantly white community who's not going to deal with the racialized dimensions of it, you're going to be dealing again then with issues of anthropocentrism and hierarchical oppression. So in this sense, I would argue approaching it from the same kind of perspective of what's actually going on in the community, helping them do an assessment and understanding how what they're eating impacts them, how it harms their bodies, how it harms their communities, how it harms others, right? So then I think that all that stuff is naturally in line with their theological beliefs, but you have to walk people there. The mistake I feel like too many clergy, and I'll speak to clergy at this point because these are the people I'm in conversation with about this, the mistake that so many religious leaders make is they get converted to like a vegetarian or vegan diet, and they immediately believe, okay, now it's my job to like literally convert everybody else. And then with that kind of, and I appreciate that zeal. Well, I appreciate it. Like it has to be done in a particular way that I think is more invitational, that actually honors the lived experience of the community. And the last thing I'll say is the kind of veganism I argue for in my own book is borrowed of a term created and coined, I would say, by App and Silko in their book Afroism, called Black Veganism. And what this is, the term Black added to veganism really is a marker that it's more than just about diet. It's really about an anti-oppressive way of being in the world. And it recognizes that it's what I argue in the book is that it's a situation-based and context-based approach to veganism. So I grew up on food stamps, like the literal food stamps, where they're actually in a book where none of you probably know what I'm talking about. Well, maybe some of you do. Like, you know, they were in an actual book, right? And so there's no way that we could have actually ate a plant-based diet or a vegan diet when I was younger. That just wasn't possible. But there was a way, I would argue, we could have been taught, especially theologically, about how the food we're eating either helps promote and move us towards this place of self-determination and liberation, or is actually complicit in our own suffering and oppression. And so what I'm arguing for is a way of helping folks theologically to theologize and to begin to think theologically about food and about eating in ways that moves us toward this anti-oppression way of being in the world, which I wrap up with veganism as a kind of Christian spiritual praxis that is invitational. Again, that recognizes that everybody can not eat meat, but everybody can begin to eat in ways that allows these things to be made known so that we can move towards a kind of anti-oppressive diet. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Carter and Dr. Crane.
Thank you. So I want to begin with an obvious point. Kashrut is not a monolithic system in ink, much less in practice. Indeed, divergent kashrut practices often prevent Jews from dining together, as some view that what others do is not stringent enough, as too strict, or the like. In some powerful and frankly disappointing ways, kashrut divides, not just Jews who abide by it from non-Jews, but Jews from other Jews as well. As Dr. Carter said at the top of our conversation, hospitality is a key trope by which to investigate religious traditions and practices. And on this point, perhaps kashrut is more problematic to Jewish hospitality than one might anticipate. Nevertheless, I suggest that something powerful can emerge from the very fact of kashrut's existence. Let's call it priming. Because kashrut is an ancient and ongoing communal deliberation about righteous eating and the idea of clean food, Jews are primed to think about food and eating. This is not insignificant. No matter whether an individual agrees or disagrees with all or parts of the laws of kashrut, and irrespective of whether one actually observes and practices any portion of those laws, Jews across the board are primed to wrestle with communal standards. They entertain, whether consciously or unwittingly, the idea that there are, could, or perhaps should be communal standards and common practices when it comes to food and eating. For Jews, eating is not just a private, hedonistic enterprise done in a social or moral vacuum. On the contrary, from the earliest layers of Jewish sources and on through the millennia of Jewish argumentation on the nuances of kashrut, the lesson has never wavered. Producing and accessing food and eating is necessarily a contextualized activity. And because of this, it must contend with values, limits, and consequences. In short, Jews are primed, in part by kashrut's very existence, to wrestle with competing values when it comes to consuming the world around them. Jews are thus primed to understand that food and eating are dynamic ethical relationships. Given this, I would ask communities and individuals, whether they're Jewish or not, to identify their core values and then flesh out what those values are. What do they mean when they say justice is a core value or principle, or compassion, or sustainability, or ahimsa, non-violence, or humility, or holiness, or tradition, or witness? What do those terms really mean? How are those values prioritized? When they conflict, which ones should prevail and why? What is suffering and why should suffering matter? What do respect, dignity, and sovereignty really mean? Then I would ask them to look at their food purchasing practices. To what degree do those food purchasing practices align with, reflect, and reinforce those values? And if not, why? What about those foods and how they're sourced? In which way does the labor involved reflect their values? How do they want to be associated with those labor practices? What about the environmental impact of those foods or the impact on the animals that they may or may not be consuming? If one is not already supporting those who have difficulty accessing food, what does this say about one's actual values? I would also ask communities to reflect on what has not been said in their communities about food and what is not said in these very deliberations. Specifically, what strategies are deployed to avoid discomfort when it comes to thinking about and speaking on food-related issues. It's really hard to talk about one's own diet, much less other people's dietary patterns. Are there underlying concerns about shame, ego, reputation, economic viability that preclude addressing certain aspects about food? What about class and race issues that Dr. Carter had mentioned? And also about community and tribal affiliation, like Dr. Afendilian has mentioned. In your community, what is the nature or culture of avoidance? a pattern of minimizing or explanations for exceptionalism, that other people should be concerned about these issues, but we don't. Such strategies are often cloaked in religious garb, theological language, ritual traditions. It's what we do. It's also a good idea, I think, from time to time to examine and reassess all of those values and practices vis-a-vis the best of today's convictions. Even if one is not yet primed to engage with these perhaps uncomfortable questions and conversations, one should begin with one's own stories and values. In which ways do your dietary patterns make you proud? And if they do not make you proud, what are you going to do about it? And as Hillel used to say, if not now, when?
Thank you so much, Dr. Crane and Dr. Sharma, if you don't mind finishing off our conversation.
No, but these are all such great presentations that I feel like I should go do something. So I, like Dr. Carter said, I'm really reluctant to speak about Hinduism as a whole because it really is Hinduisms. And as I mentioned in my earlier thoughts, is that a vegetarian Hinduism is professed and pushed by the upper caste, upper class, and by right-wing Hindu fundamentalists. And it is to the detriment of kind of Hinduism as a whole, because it's an attempt to force a position, a privileged position on the vast majority of Hindus. And given the long and painful history of the oppression in the caste and class system, it would not be something I would be comfortable doing at all, right? So God forbid, so to speak, that I speak on and tell what all Hindus ought to do. I will just be sounding like the BJP then. That can't happen. So if we think about Hinduism in this way, Hinduisms as with Christianities, you can just imagine that you have so many different layers and different types of Hindus out there. You have Hindus that are differentiate according to their class, as I mentioned, according to their caste, which is a subsection of class, and of course it's also geographic. So what somebody, an upper caste Hindu in Uttar Pradesh, is going to be very different how they eat from, say, a lower caste Hindu from some village in Tamil Nadu, which might be largely Shakti worshippers of the goddess. It might be a completely different community, and it is not my place to say. And the kind of history of Hinduism has been marred by upper caste Hindus who found it that it was their place to say. So that said, as you know from my comments about Jainism, is that Jains are vegetarian and are vegan in some cases. And I am in fact married to a Jain. She's probably somewhere over there. And it would be more interesting then, rather than telling Hindus what they ought to do, because it's not my place to do that. It's far more interesting to stand behind a Jain shield and advise Hindus what to do from a Jain perspective, right? That's to say that Jains make strong arguments towards Hindus and showing flaws in Hindu positions to argue that Hindus ought to become vegetarian. And the way Jains do that is they really play off of the consequences, the karmic consequences of eating a sentient creature that is not unlike oneself. And Jains historically have digests where they explain what are the consequences for eating animals that have what they call senses. So human beings have 6 senses, and a worm has 1 or 2 senses. And they have these category systems where they place different animals and creatures in these how many senses they have, and subsequently what are the consequences if you eat one. So if you kill another human being or eat another human being, we haven't talked about cannibalism, but if you kill another human being, then there are tremendous karmic consequences that obviously work against you. If you accidentally step on a worm, there are karmic consequences, but nowhere near the karmic consequences that you would get if you intentionally kill somebody, right? So for Jains, and when Jains want to argue that Hindus should become vegetarians, or that Christians or Muslims or Jews should become vegetarians, they are going to want to have you think about consequences in a karmic sort of scenario, a karmic world. And you may not, of course, buy into it, but it's certainly the way it works in the Jain tradition. So I remember when I first met my wife, or my wife-to-be, right? My father-in-law, who is a very, very ultra-Orthodox Jain, that he spent like half of our first meeting telling me that even though I'm a vegetarian, I come from a history of Hindus who eat meat and I'm going to pay for it consequently, and so on and so forth. So Jains do try and convert, one could say. Again, it's not my place to convert the vast majority of Hindus who are, especially from this privileged position that I inhabit, but I would encourage my father-in-law or my wife to do it. And within the context of Jainism, Jains, like Dr. Crane was thinking about the importance of food and eating, is that that's all that Jains think about is food and eating, and what you shouldn't eat, and the consequences of what you should eat. And the final goal for Jain monks and nuns is to fast until you die, because they recognize that any kind of eating, even the lowest possible sentient creature, even a stalk of celery, will cause violence. And so that the only way to prevent this is to fast until you die. So those are some thoughts of mine. Thanks for this opportunity.
Thank you all so much for those wonderful answers, and I'd like to invite anyone who has a question to put that question into the Q&A now.
I'll go ahead and pose one of them that is from an attendee. And this one, I think, is primarily going to be for you, Dr. Crane, from a family member listening. So we have, I think, more attendees than just those who are signed in. We have family members listening. When it comes to being Jewish and a vegan, eating habits have been used as an angle in being witnessed to, saying that to be vegan and maintain Jewish religious integrity is impossible, based on sacrifices being dictated in the Torah, Cain and Abel, for example. How would you approach this in regards to maintaining your Jewish identity as well as a practicing vegan?
Yeah, so there is perhaps a myth or a misunderstanding that Jews must eat animals because there are some characters in the biblical corpus who practiced animal sacrifice, and several of the meals that are described in the biblical narratives describe those meals including meat dishes. Jews certainly farmed animals in the biblical world, and certainly through the rabbinic period, and even all the way up into the 20th century, Jews have been farmers and practice animal husbandry, and there are wonderful texts about good animal husbandry practices. So it is permitted to eat meat within the Jewish textual tradition. I cannot say that Judaism is a wholesale vegetarian, much less a vegan religious tradition, but it certainly can endorse and welcome a vegan and vegetarian dietary pattern as a legitimate way to consume the world. The practice of eating meat was, at least in the biblical world, most associated with the sacrificial system, which was performed by the sacrificial cult in the tabernacle and then in the temple in Jerusalem. Now that we don't have the temple, there is no sacrificial cult, and therefore the need to kill animals for religious purposes has now been eliminated. And so a strong argument, theologically, liturgically speaking, is that because we don't have that sacrificial cult in an existing temple in Jerusalem, there is no need, no religious need for Jews to engage in the raising and the ultimate demise of animals, much less consuming them. So I encourage this anonymous family member to keep a backbone and be proud of being a vegetarian Jew or a vegan Jew, that this is a legitimate way to consume the world.
Great, and I'll go ahead with our next question. Growing up in a Catholic school, I was once told by my religion professor that dogs do not go to heaven. How do the various religions in this panel see the afterlife in relation to what happens to animals after death?
So I can start on that. For Native peoples, animals have souls, and they may have an afterlife. The Cherokees speak about animals going to the darkening land, the same place that humans go to. There's also ideas that animals can be reborn. And so if you are a native hunter and you say kill a deer, and you do that in the proper way, right? You try to avoid the suffering of the animal, you use all the animal's meat, you thank the animal, and so forth. The animal can basically put on another coat of fur and be reborn. So there's certainly an idea of an afterlife and a reincarnation for animals.
I know from the Christian tradition, I think there's multiple different perspectives on this. I mean, I've heard some folks say that, yes, you know, when you look at the creation narratives, there's this aspect where you might say non-human animals also have a soul and have, in some sense, when you read, you know, Paul writing in Romans, talking about the earth and the rocks like are groaning in pain, this idea that there is this way in which people are being pulled or lured toward the thing that's next, right? This eschatological hope. I think you can read that into the text or see that the way that might be have a place in there. I actually think this brings up fundamental questions about heaven and the importance of one might place on practicing religion or necessarily something with as the outcome or goal, right? And I would argue that, you know, for me, I've never been in a religious community that had a blessing of the animals, but I have taken my animals to something like that. And my wife is a veterinarian, and she's actually a veterinary oncologist, and so essentially she's a chaplain. And a big part of her job is ushering people and their non-human companion animals to their death in a most painless way possible. And what I think she has helped me understand is that it's almost as important, I would argue in some sense more important, for that way that it ends, right? And our companion animal's life ends, has a fundamental role and important shape on how we imagine what the afterlife could be, like as to imagining what's next. That there has to be this space of both reciprocity, of comfort and compassion and mutuality. And in so doing that, then I think it leaves open the space and opportunity for this kind of hope for what might be, but not with this definitive, we know this is what's going to happen. I guess for me personally, I don't operate with that kind of definitive, this is what's next. I don't need that to fundamentally believe in God, a God of love and justice, right? That's not a core aspect of my own theological belief. But I do believe in the importance of relationship. I do believe the importance of mending those relationships while we're here. And my experience, again, through my wife, is to say that seems to be the most important aspect. I know that's kind of a dodge of the question, but that's just, I thought I could leave some insight with someone who has to literally help people do this all the time.
I would just chime in here, if I may, to say that I see this question asking a deeper, more profound question, which is, can animals be religious subjects? And do they get certain religious goodies like heaven or blessings, etc.? That will be peculiar to the theology of a particular religious tradition. But can animals be a religious subject? I think that what we're hearing from the panelists here is that across at least these religious traditions, and yes, they can be. What's happened is that has been beaten out of our sensibility through contemporary farmed animal practices, ever since the bludgeoning of the buffaloes in the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries. This notion that we can act towards animals with impunity, really destroys and that notion that animals are religious subjects too. And so one of the things I think that we're struggling with, perhaps those of us who are working in this field as scholars and activists and clergy, is that we're trying to reclaim these religious sensibilities, that we're not the only creatures who are taken seriously by our religious traditions. We need to somehow reclaim that reverence for non-human existence that our religious traditions variously teach in various ways.
So we're getting short on time here. I know we're actually a few minutes over, but we've got just two more quick questions. Well, one, they're neither quick questions, but two more questions. One, again, Dr. Crane, we have a question. Why does the Jewish Bible have a ban on eating animals with cloven hooves and milk with meat at the same sitting?
Yeah, as if I could answer those questions in 1 minute. But the prohibition about combining meat and milk is only found just a handful of times. I think it's at most 3 times in the biblical text. And then from that, it basically says you shall not boil a kid in its mother's milk. And from that, we get this prohibition about having a bacon cheeseburger. So why, how that is, the rabbis go to great lengths to create what's called fences around the Torah. That if there's a biblical law, they want to make sure that you never impinge or transgress that biblical law. So they create more fences and more fences and more restrictions so that that core law will never be transgressed. So they've created a wide range of protections about when you eat meat, how long you have to wait until you can eat dairy, and vice versa, what you do with the dishes, what you do with the utensils, et cetera, and how you clean all of those things. Those are all fences around that core biblical kernel. About why humans are not allowed to eat terrestrial animals with cloven hooves, unless they have cloven hooves and chew their cud. That's just how they divided up the terrestrial animal world, is to identify those ruminants, domesticatable ruminants. And they wanted to earmark them as therefore consumable, and to distinguish them from other terrestrial animals. Again, Jews across the board read about all of this last week. So it's in last week's Parsha, Leviticus chapter 11, I think it is.
This last question is huge, and I'm sure that there will be no way to answer this in any small amount of time. The question is, can all these perspectives be right at the same time? And of course, that's a heavily, for those of us who do religious studies, right? That's a pretty heavy question. So anyone who wants to jump in on, can all these perspectives be right at the same time?
I'll just say one quick thing about that from a Native perspective, because, you know, if you think about creation stories, right? Almost every religion that I've ever studied has more than one. And I'll say sometimes, you know, in this creation story in the Hebrew Bible, we can see X, and the students are like, wait, there's more than one? Yes. So they already exist. They're already together, and there's already multiple ways to understand things. For Native peoples, there are all kinds of creation stories within any one tribe. So, and you wouldn't say that the Eagle clan's creation story is wrong just because you're Bear clan. You don't have that right. So Native peoples are used to living with other people's stories. I would say they're used to hybridity. They're used to learning from other peoples who live near them. You know, when the Navajo and the Apache migrated down to Pueblo country, they learned to become farmers. They weren't that before. They were gatherers and hunters, right? So Native peoples learn from each other all the time. They have to accommodate those diverse religious perspectives. So there are many, the vast majority of Natives today identify as Christian, but as Dr. Carter's mentioned, Native Christianities look a lot different than you're going to encounter at the church you maybe grew up in. And they're comfortable with that. They're comfortable with having traditional Native elements expressed in a Christian worship service. There's one example, and then I'll shut up. The Koyukon of interior Alaska, a very important time for them is when the ice on their rivers is breaking up. I say it's important because the people like to visit with each other. And, you know, before the cars and whatever, the rivers were the highways. So that's how you could get out and go see your friends and family in other villages. But when the ice is breaking up, it's very dangerous. You can die if you go out at the wrong time. And so it's always been traditional for the Koyakan to say prayers to ask for an easy breakup of the ice. And this is an indigenous tradition, except now they say those prayers in the Christian church they belong to.
So I want to thank all of you all that I'll add since as, oh, there's Dr. Carter's baby. Hi. And Dr. Afton-Tillian has had a cat. I was about to grab some puppies, but yeah, I teach the history of the Christian tradition as Dr. Carter does. And there's a book that I sometimes have my students read by a theologian, Carter Hayward. And the title of it is Saving Jesus from Those Who Are Right. And so I'm just right, you know, is problematic. Okay. I'm going to let Rebecca close it out, and I want to take this personal time to thank the 4 panelists and the attendees who've come. This has been wonderful. Thank you so very much, all of you, for being part of this event. It's really, I've learned a lot sitting here tonight. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you so much for joining us. And I'd like to thank again the Department of Religion, the Office of Paideia, and Dr. Hobgood for their support and funding, and each of our 4 panelists for your unique contributions. Thank you so much. And thank you to all of our participants who came to learn and share, and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Safe and well, all.
Have a nice day.
Isaiah said hello. Just in case you guys are curious.
Hi back, Isaiah.
I'll tell him you all said hi.
That's awesome.